Today at the National Press Club, Productivity Commission Chair Danielle Wood. Ahead of this week's Economic Reform Roundtable, she'll discuss ways to lift the country's stalled productivity growth. Her address is titled Growth Imperative: How to Fix Our Productivity Problem. Danielle Wood with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Tom Connell, I'm the club's president and an anchor at Sky News Australia. Our guest today is Danielle Wood, Chair of the Productivity Commission, whose time in the spotlight I think has well and truly landed. Believe it or not, despite all the articles on red tape, tax, tariffs, IR, the Productivity Commission or the Productivity Roundtable hasn't actually begun yet. It is tomorrow for 3 days in Canberra. A lot of people will be at that table, but I suspect Danielle Wood might have a bit more influence than most. The chair of the PC, of course. She also has an honours degree in economics from the University of Adelaide, 2 master's degrees, one in economics and one in competition law from the University of Melbourne. I've probably forgot 1 or 2 as well. So she may just have a little bit of influence at that very important meeting for the future of the economy. Please join me in welcoming Danielle Wood to the podium.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Tom. Thank you to Morris and the Press Club for the invite to be here. I'd like to start by recognising we are on the lands of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We are so lucky to live in a nation with such a rich history, and I am very grateful for the First Nations Australians who've taken the opportunity to share that history, culture and policy understanding with me since I've been in this role. I can see so many policy luminaries in the room. Nat James here at the front, Jenny Wilkinson. A special shout out to Assistant Minister Andrew Lee. He is the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, but also very relevantly today for productivity. I'd also like to say a special welcome to my fellow PC commissioners, Alison Roberts, Alex Robson, and to the wonderful PC staff. I owe anything even half clever I have to say today to their work and insights. So, as we've heard, tomorrow the Treasurer, Shadow Treasurer, representatives from the business, unions, community sector, government and the Academy will meet in the Cabinet Room. For 3 days, without natural light and mobile phones, we will thrash out potential reforms to kickstart Australia's flagging productivity growth. Now, to some, this might sound like a cruel and unusual punishment. To me, this is Christmas, the grand finale of MasterChef, and Productivity Commission's 2024 table tennis victory over Treasury, all combined. And I say this not because talking about policy for 3 days is my idea of a good time, although it is, but because of what this roundtable represents. I am thrilled by the new appetite for economic reform that the Roundtable has created over the past 2 months, and by the Treasurer's elevation of productivity as the primary focus of this government. Ultimately, the government will be judged on its outcomes and the actions it achieves. But it has taken an important step by recognising and pursuing economic growth and the productivity that drives it as the prime goal of policy. This growth mindset, the elevation of growth and the benefits it brings, has been missing from Australian policy for far too long. Let me tell you why it matters. We all want our kids to grow up having better lives than we have. We want them to be healthy, to get a good education, to have more options in their careers, and perhaps even a bit more leisure time than some of us have managed. That expectation that life will get better for each successive generation is Australia's generational bargain. And for many generations we have fulfilled that promise, until perhaps now. Overwhelmingly today, young people believe that they won't live better lives than their parents did. And as Chair of the Productivity Commission, I'm worried too. Australians born in the 1990s, who hit the job market in the 2010s when economic growth was slow, were the first generation not to earn more than people born a decade before. People of that generation, now in their 30s, have struggled to buy a house because policy choices have contributed to house prices growing much faster than incomes for the best part of 3 decades. This generation will bear more of the cost of addressing climate change, both the impacts of wilder weather and the policy response, because Australian policymakers have for too long avoided the lowest cost policy choices. This is the same generation that will bear the brunt of population ageing and the pressure it will put on the care workforce and government budgets. At their heart, these are productivity challenges, and by adopting a growth mindset, we improve our capacity to address them. Productivity comes when we get more for our work efforts. It is not about working more hours. It is not about a boss standing behind you with a stopwatch. It is not about running down our natural resources. Productivity comes from better skills and training, from new technologies, from policy settings that make it easier to switch jobs or to start and run a business. Anything that helps us harness our economic potential. So why does this matter for generations to come? Productivity growth is the only way to sustainably lift wages and opportunities over time. Important for all of us, but especially for those young people with their whole careers ahead of them. Productivity growth helps us build things better and faster, a must if we are to deliver the well-located homes, clean energy and digital infrastructure we will need to future-proof our economy. Productivity growth can help us square the circle on ever-growing care demands with limited budget headroom. And finally, productivity growth gives us more opportunities to respond to whatever challenges the world throws our way, a critical buffer in the new reality of heightened geopolitical uncertainty. And that is why it troubles me that our productivity growth engine is stalling. For the past decade, productivity has grown less than a quarter of its 60-year average. This isn't just a COVID effect. Our growth was slowing well before the pandemic and has returned to those sluggish levels in the years since. Nor is it just an Australian phenomenon. In almost every OECD nation, productivity growth was significantly lower in the years before COVID than it was through the 1990s and early 2000s. The structural factors contributing to our productivity problem include flatlining business investment, a reduction in economic dynamism, and strong growth in non-market services. I'll return to these, but first I want to point to what is another common phenomenon across many richer nations: less policy emphasis on growth and a declining reform appetite. Through the 80s and 90s, governments embarked on a series of reforms to open Australia to the world. They reduced trade and investment barriers, they dismantled regulatory impediments to competition in markets like banking, telecommunications, energy and transport. Recent OECD research suggests that these product market reforms contributed around 0.25 percentage points to annual labour productivity growth. But in the absence of ongoing reforms, the reform dividend has faded. Now, it is important to acknowledge that when it comes to productivity, governments don't hold all the cards. Geopolitics, technology, business risk appetite, leadership skills all matter too. But what research like the OECD paper says to me is that policies are also critical for growth. Governments support the enablers of growth, like research, education and training, population health. Governments shape incentives to work and invest through taxes and regulatory settings. And as major funders and providers of services such as infrastructure and care, they set the pace of productivity growth across large parts of Australia's economy. I think it is fair to say that policymakers have not pulled as hard or as often on these levers as some of us would have liked over the past 2 decades. The reasons commonly advanced include decline in bipartisanship, the influence of vested interests, the 24/7 media cycle. These factors have almost certainly played a role. And to be fair to today's leaders, the reforms required now are more complex to design and implement than some of the major reforms delivered in the 80s and 90s. You only get to float the dollar once. But I think there is another reason as well. Growth has simply fallen down the list of priorities in policy making. This manifests not just in less economic reform, but in decisions by governments, federal, state and local, to pay less attention to growth trade-offs in pursuing other policy goals. Nowhere is this more evident than growth in the regulatory burden. The number of words in Commonwealth Acts of Parliament and legislative instruments has ballooned in the 2 decades to 2020. In 2024, 50% of small businesses surveyed by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry reported spending more time on regulatory compliance than in the previous 12 months. Regulatory creep is in part a function of the demand for governments to do something every time an issue emerges. When combined with Australians' tendency to look to government for answers, our Canberra fix, we have ended up with a system that dampens growth. Recent Productivity Commission research found the time taken to build houses and apartments has grown by 50% over the past 30 years. And it's not the time laying bricks that's blown out, it's the approvals processes, from planning to heritage to building approvals to environmental and traffic impact statements. The same challenges apply to navigating approvals for major projects, including mining and renewable energy. New South Wales takes on average more than 9 years to approve wind projects. And these regulatory hairballs have found our way into almost every corner of our economy. In Brisbane, a would-be cafe owner must navigate 31 approvals and licences from various levels of government before it can serve its first flat white. Now, better processes can help cut through some of these regulatory Gordian knots, but a second and more difficult issue remains. Government action often involves trading off one goal for another. Sometimes the good things do all point in the same direction, but other times we have to make tough choices. Heritage and density restrictions can prioritise preserving a version of local amenity at the expense of more and cheaper housing. Government procurement rules that prioritise local jobs or buying from small business do so at the expense of lower cost infrastructure and services. Ever more stringent requirements for energy efficiency in the construction code prioritise small future energy savings over making it faster and cheaper to provide housing. These conversations are hard. Nobody wants to be the big meanie critiquing the worthwhile objective. But we need to remember not delivering as much housing or infrastructure or crimping future innovation and growth are also deeply undesirable outcomes. A growth mindset means elevating growth and its benefits across all policy decisions. It does not mean government should never intervene or pursue other conflicting goals, but the benefits of growth should not be traded away quietly or lightly. After John F. Kennedy became US President in 1961, his focus on economic renewal led the US Department of Commerce to put up signs asking, "What have you done for growth today?" Perhaps it is time we distribute those signs to government agencies and ministerial offices all around our country. So let me turn now to some of the actions that governments can take to boost growth. In the past month, the Productivity Commission has released 5 interim reports, setting out recommendations to improve productivity across what the government calls its 5 pillars: economic dynamism, skills in the workforce, data and digital, care, and the net zero transformation. For each, we have focused on a small set of policy reforms that could help shift the dial. That means we don't canvass every worthwhile idea, but we have deliberately sidestepped some areas where major reforms are in train or have recently occurred. But we think it is a pretty good to-do list. Let me give you a rundown of some of the big ideas. Our first report focuses on kickstarting business dynamism and investment. Business investment as a share of the economy has declined more than 3 percentage points since the global financial crisis. And when the animal spirits of business go out to pasture, economy-wide productivity suffers because we have less capital and new technology for each worker. Investment has slowed for many reasons, but Australia's tax system certainly doesn't help. The headline rate in our corporate tax system is uncompetitive by international standards, the 5th highest in the OECD. But just as significantly, our current system does not treat all investment equally. It imposes the biggest cost on high-risk, long-lived and capital-intensive investment, the type that can offer the biggest productivity kicker. And by favouring debt finance over equity finance, it disadvantages smaller and newer companies. Different and less distortionary tax bases are available for corporate tax. No doubt, switching bases comes with some risk and cost, and it is prudent to hasten slowly. Our draft recommendations represent a serious start on this journey towards better investment incentives. We propose cutting the headline corporate tax rate to 20% for businesses with a turnover over $1 billion. That is 99% of Australian companies. Additional revenue to help balance that tax cut would be collected via a cash flow tax of 5% on all businesses. We do this with an eye to the fiscal realities. The package is revenue neutral over the medium term. The shift to the cash flow tax rewards investment by allowing business to expense their capital expenditure in the year that it occurs. It will promote investment amongst newer and smaller firms, allowing them to grow and challenge incumbents. It is simple to administer, relying purely on information already submitted to the ATO. Our modelling suggests this first step in the tax mix switch journey would increase investment by $7.4 billion and GDP by $14.6 billion. Good enough to get out of bed for, I would think. Our second pillar focuses on skilling the workforce of the future. In our modern services-based economy, it is our human capital, the embodied skills and knowledge of Australians, that is critical for our future productivity. Human capital starts in our schools. But data from the OECD shows serious declines in the performance of Australian students in reading and maths since 2000. The learning gap between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds is large and widens through school. More than half of the most economically disadvantaged 15-year-olds in Australia are not proficient readers. A nation with a growth mindset simply cannot afford to leave so many of its young people unprepared for work and life. Turning this round will take a lot of work, but a vital first step is making sure that all teachers and students have access to high quality education technology and learning materials. We have a patchwork of approaches to EdTech and AI in the classroom and across our school systems. And while some schools have access to high quality curriculum materials that free up teacher time and ensure the quality of student lessons, not all do. The result is something like a lesson lottery. That is why the PC recommends the Australian Government ensures quality vetted materials and EdTech tools are available in every Australian classroom. But learning doesn't end in the classroom, of course. In a world of ever-changing technology and jobs, it is vital to support people to learn and develop skills through their lives. One way to upskill is to provide training in the workplace, but rates of work-related training have fallen over the past 2 decades. When we compare ourselves with the UK, Singapore, Norway, and other countries with similar levels of tertiary education, Australia's work-related training participation is unusually low. Many working Australians are missing out on the opportunity to augment and improve their skills, including in areas like AI and management capability. Those working in small and medium businesses are much more likely to miss out, often due to cost. To help overcome this cost barrier, we recommend financial incentives targeted at small and medium businesses so all Australians can get access to the training they need. Our third pillar focuses on harnessing data and digital technologies. And when I think about what is going to shift the dial in Australian productivity over the next decade, this is it. Throughout history, new technologies like electricity, the internal combustion engine, and the internet have unlocked major productivity gains that fundamentally change how we live and work. AI is another one of these potentially transformative general purpose technologies. The PC's early estimates suggest that AI could add more than 4% to labour productivity over the next decade. That would translate to an additional $116 billion in economic activity, equivalent to boosting incomes by $4,300 a year over that period. A growth mindset means that we must not regulate our way out of that opportunity. While managing risk is important, we do not think that a new and overarching framework for AI is the way to go. That's because the risks posed by AI are mainly existing risks. AI may make it cheaper, easier and faster for bad actors to create harms, But most of these harms, from product safety to discrimination to fraud, are already covered by existing regulatory frameworks. The process of identifying gaps in these frameworks and addressing them for the AI world is quietly going on through government. This work should be done urgently, comprehensively, but in preference to broad-based technology regulation, which has been shown overseas to reduce innovation, digital jobs and investment. Our report also looks at how consumers can get the benefits from the new digital world. Increased data throws open the opportunity for easier switching, new businesses and better consumer outcomes. But to realise this, consumers need access to their own data. The consumer data right already supports consumer data access in banking and energy, but its prescriptive approach has been more costly and less flexible than hoped. Even so, its use is increasing. We recommend alternative lighter touch regimes to support consumer data access in new areas. This might be farmers enabled to draw data from machinery to inform their crop management practices, or tenants accessing their rental payment history to allow banks to seamlessly verify their loan applications. In this way, the digital transformation should create opportunities for all Australians. Our fourth pillar looks at care. In the past 2 decades, care services, healthcare, disability care, aged care, early learning and care have grown strongly across the Australian economy. Growth in the care and support workforce has been 3 times faster than total employment across the economy in recent years. Since these services have lower measured productivity, their expansion weighs on the headline numbers. But to be clear, this does not mean that expansions in care are always a problem. Care sectors provide vital supports to many Australians, and some of their apparently low productivity simply represents challenges in capturing improvements in service quality. But the numbers do also reflect difficulties of achieving productivity gains in the mainly labour-intensive sectors. Now, to some extent, this is changing. New data and digital technologies reach into care in a way that can improve the efficiency of delivery and the quality of service. For example, AI has been used for rostering and administrative tasks. Robots now clear dirty dishes and push laundry carts in some aged care facilities. Government policies need to support rather than block these transformations. But we can't just hope that technology will save us. Governments must also reform the way they regulate and fund services to break the siloed approach to decision making. One recommendation is to better align safety and quality regulation across the sector. The current plethora of requirements creates unnecessary burdens and costs for care users, workers and providers. One provider told the PEC it was required to complete about 15 separate accreditation processes across its health and social care businesses. Another said it was accountable for 350 pieces of legislation and regulations and has a minimum of 16 program audits every 3 years, many of which require the provision of the same information over and over. A growth mindset would mean following the principle of report once, use often when it comes to care services. The PC has put forward a plan to streamline duplication of quality and safety regulation across the NDIS, aged care and veterans care. We also outline longer-term objectives for government, including developing a single set of practice and quality standards and exploring the suitability of a single regulator. These reforms will reduce costs for providers and workers, lower regulatory entry barriers, and improve the safety of care. A rare policy hat-trick. We also recommend governments embrace evidence-backed prevention programs. In a range of areas of social spending, from health to housing to child protection, prevention activities can improve and reduce long-term costs across government. But budget processes are not well set up to take into account these longer-term dividends. Now, the budget hawks might understandably be on high alert. There is a risk that every proposed policy gets put in a shiny prevention wrapper. That is why we have recommended a Prevention Framework Advisory Board that will only recommend interventions with a strong evidentiary backing. The body would take the guesswork out of making public investments in prevention, just as the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee provides a consistent, rigorous framework for assessing drug listings for the PBS. Getting this right should deliver better outcomes for Australians and long-term cost savings for government. Now, in our final pillar report, the government asked us to look for productivity opportunities in climate policy. The net zero transition will transform our economy from top to bottom. My former colleague at the Grattan Institute, Tony Wood, calls it an industrial revolution on a deadline. Getting the right mix of policies, the carrots and sticks to incentivise emission reductions, matters hugely for the cost of this challenge. A single national carbon price would be the most efficient and lowest cost way to reduce emissions, particularly if it had bipartisan support to ensure its longevity. But without it, we can still make substantial progress by continuing to build a more consistent and market-based set of emissions reductions incentives. This means addressing some gaps in our current emission reduction policies for heavy vehicles, the electricity market post-2030, and smaller industrial facilities. And it means winding back duplicative and high-cost policies, such as fringe benefit tax concessions for electric vehicles. Net zero is also an infrastructure challenge. To get where we need to go, Australia needs to install large numbers of wind farms, solar farms, and big batteries, along with thousands of kilometres of transmission lines. Approvals to support the rollout need to happen faster. At the moment, the average renewable project takes 500 days for approval under federal environmental laws. Overdue reforms to these laws, as recommended by the Samuel Review, are a priority. But we also need to set the regulator up for success. A well-resourced strike team with strong clean energy capability should be dedicated to approvals for high-priority national projects. And a Coordinator General should work with and across governments to break through roadblocks and keep approvals on track. Given the size of the environmental and economic prize, net zero could be ground zero for productivity reform. So, those are just some of our policy recommendations. If you are interested in a full list, you can go and find them on the Productivity Commission's website. But in the process of compiling these reports, I've reflected on a few lessons of what a growth mindset looks like. Lesson 1 is regulate with growth in mind. And it's no surprise to me that so many of the PC's recommendations come back to improving the way that governments regulate our economy. Sometimes we can look to better processes to help, things like digital tools for submitting and assessing approvals, making regulators more accountable for approval timeframes, front door services to make all the different channels easier to navigate. But what we also need is leadership from the top when the policy sausage is being made. Ministers should always weigh up the impacts of new policies on economic growth and productivity. We recommend the government put out a clear statement of intent to this effect, backed with upfront regulatory reform. Governments need to bake in the process of asking themselves, what have you done for growth today? Lesson 2, real growth comes from new ideas and technology. Productivity growth can come from different places: more investment, improvements in education and worker skills, more efficient uses of labour and capital. But over time, the most important driver is new ideas. It's new ideas, new products, new processes, new ways of managing people that contribute to ever-growing living standards. And here is the good news. While physical inputs reach limits, human ingenuity knows no bounds. A growth mindset means fostering the way for Australia to benefit from a combination of our own innovations, but also using and building on the inventiveness of others. That's why the PC favours policy and regulatory approaches that focus on outcomes. For example, relying more on consumer outcomes in privacy regulations and avoiding technology-specific regulation in AI. We do not know what creative solutions to our problems Australian workers and businesses might come up with, but we should let them focus on the end game rather than telling them how they need to get there. Third, productivity is a game of inches, but it can be a lot of inches. There is simply no policy reform that can bring productivity growth back to its long-term average of 1.6%. To shift the dial, government's going to have to make a lot of pro-productivity decisions. Supply-side policy reform in the 2020s looks less like a small number of iconic reforms and more like a process of continual boundary pushing, some big, some small, but across a range of policy fronts. In movie parlance, less Oppenheimer, more everything, everywhere, all at once. The good news is that reform packages can be more than the sum of their parts. This is true of our recommendations too. Reforming corporate tax while taking the right approach to AI regulation and supporting upskilling could unleash a wave of AI-driven investment. Clearer carbon price signals alongside faster clean energy approvals will pick up the pace of the energy transition. And together, these reforms will add to Australia's confidence and dynamism. Inches can add up to yards. Institutions that are set up to deliver these types of reform packages are important. For this reason, I'm particularly excited about the relaunched National Competition Policy. NCP, like its predecessor in the 1990s, provides the policy infrastructure to deliver waves of reform that reduce barriers to competition and growth. Such institutions help the government win the game of inches that is improving our productivity performance. So, let me end by coming back to the young person born in the 1990s, now a decade into their career. If we could boost growth back to its historic average, that worker would be at least $14,000 better off a year by 2035. They and their families would have not just more stuff, but more choices. Better jobs, better services, the option to enjoy more leisure. And while there is no single way to kickstart productivity growth, policy has an important role to play. Today, I've given you a taster of some of the PC's practical reform suggestions. These and many others will be discussed at tomorrow's roundtable. I am optimistic that there is a package here that can make a difference to Australia's prosperity. Together, it shows what it takes to make a growth mindset to policy. Governments need to embed the importance of growth in every decision they make. It means engaging with trade-offs, better program delivery and design, and the boring but important work of reducing administrative burden. We must ensure that governments pursue a growth agenda for the benefits of businesses and workers today, but more importantly, for generations to come. And that is worth a few days locked in a room for. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Now, you've been in the policy game for a while. You're used to putting ideas out there and getting what we call pushback in the Fourth Estate. I want to delve into AI and copyright laws, because there was an interim report where you were, I think it's fair to say, supporting, at least looking at an overhaul of copyright laws. And there's been a lot of people since, whether it be film, music, media, Fourth Estate as well, saying the AI models are already trained. This is just going to let them, make money out of it and be another blow to these industries, which do it fairly tough. What have you made of that? Have you delved into those concerns, and have you, do you have an open mind as to whether your initial push would still be a benefit overall to the Australian economy in those industries?
Yeah, look, thank you. It's an important question, and this is the joy of an interim report. You put ideas out into the world and feedback comes back. And we actually didn't make any recommendation on this front. We did put out a series of options. But what I do want to say about that pushback is I think it misunderstands some of the context of that particular discussion. So at the moment, we're in what I would call the worst of possible worlds. So models trained overseas are using Australian data, Australian creative content, and they are able to do that because it depends on the laws of the nation where that model is hosted. So nothing in Australian copyright laws can make a difference to that. But the world we're in, which creates uncertainty for people that might want to build models in Australia, whether that's an LLM, whether that's a low compute model sitting in a research institute, there's a lack of clarity and certainly potentially very high transaction costs if they want to use Australian content. So that's the question we were focused on. Australian copyright laws How do we support potentially an Australian AI industry? And there's a range of different options we set out. One is a text and data mining exemption. That is not a free-for-all, let's be clear. It would have some kind of fair use rule that's been adopted in places like Japan and Europe. But we've also looked at other options, or we are looking at other options. How do you soup up collecting societies? Might a licensing regime work? But I just want to be super clear. Anything that we're saying is applying to that sliver. It's about the Australian industry. What's happening overseas cannot be addressed in Australian copyright law.
And open-minded as to how that works out in terms of, similar to the previous argument, whatever it might be, music, film, media being given a slice of the income, if you like.
But we can only do that for stuff that's trained in Australia. So that's right, we're looking at whether there are ways to do that.
Okay.
But at the moment, this material is being used by overseas-based LLMs, and nothing that happens in Australian law is going to be able to address that.
I get my own feedback from colleagues saying, keep it short, we're the experts. So on that note, Jane Norman from the ABC.
One question only. Danielle, thank you so much for your speech today. As you mentioned, productivity has for some negative connotations, and whenever we talk about economic reforms, there are those who worry that there are trade-offs to be had. So I guess as you help with the beginning of this reform process, wherever it might lead us, how do you actually frame it? What happens to Australians, particularly younger Australians, if we don't change, if we continue in this path that we're on without any reforms or changes? Where does that leave Australia and particularly younger generations?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and it does, it's upsetting to me that productivity is seen as this negative thing as opposed to, something that actually helps us all lead better and broader lives. So I think, if nothing changes, we see more of the same. So if productivity continues to flatline, we see anemic economic growth. And if we think back to the world that we were in prior to COVID, we know what that looks like. It looked like a pretty unhealthy labour market, high rates of underemployment, much higher rates of unemployment than we see now. It meant younger people not seeing the wage progression that we would normally expect them to see. It meant challenges in buying a house, now renting a house. So it impedes every aspect of life. And, if you want to think about what does, potential productivity gains look like over time, now I say, think about someone in 1960 versus someone today. We have living standards that are, 3 times higher, our material living standards. We have better outcomes in so many areas like health. Crucially, we live longer. We also work fewer hours a week than that average Australian in 1960. And all of those are dividends from productivity growth. What we want is the Australian in 2070 to get those same dividends because growth continues from here on. So it matters for so many aspects of our life. It isn't about working harder, as I said, it's not about the person with the stopwatch. It's about unlocking gains from our resources to enable all Australians, and particularly young Australians, to have better lives than they do now.
Next question, Phil Curry from the AFR.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Ms Wood. Back to your the start of your speech about rules and regulations for the sake of it sometimes. I want to ask you specifically about work from home. Governments, increasingly federal and state, think they will often like to make edicts or make rules on behalf of businesses. I wonder what your specific response is to the proposal by the Victorian government that every worker in that state has the right to work from home 2 days a week if it suits that business. Do you think that's good for productivity, or should that be left to the individual enterprise, the boss and the worker?
Look, so I've talked a lot about work from home and productivity because it has been a very substantial shift that we've seen in the post-COVID world. My reading of the literature, and there is a kind of growing literature of the impacts, suggests maybe fully remote work might have some drag on productivity. You miss out of those gains that you get from being face-to-face in the office, training and spillovers. Hybrid work, 2 or 3 days a week in the office, 2 or 3 at home, seems to not have a negative impact. In fact, it might be slightly positive. And it introduces great benefits for workers, avoiding the commute, much greater flexibility to manage family and life. So I've described that as a sweet spot for productivity. I think the market has naturally found that sweet spot. I speak to employers that say, I want everyone back full time, and I'm saying, well, yep, you can do that, but you will struggle to attract and retain staff. You have to pay probably a wage premium if you want to do that. So I think the market does have a way of finding that sweet spot. So I guess, if I was to apply a growth mindset to this, I would think, what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? It's not clear to me that there needs to be a role for government in that.
Thank you.
Matthew Cranston from The Australian.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks for all the stories you've been giving journalists over the last month or so. It's been great.
Here to serve.
My question's about relevance, and don't shoot the messenger here, but in the last month or so we've had, for example, some unions saying that the Productivity Commission should be abolished. We've had big ticket recommendations such as carbon price and all sorts of things like your cash flow tax receiving pretty muted support from the business community. And when you think about it, the last big review and recommendations that a Labor government had to look upon was the Henry Tax Review. 138 recommendations, and literally none of them were implemented. What would you see as a successful percentage of implementation of the recommendations you've made under this government? And I might also ask about what you see as the mission and the relevance of the Productivity Commission over the next few years under this government.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think an institution like the Productivity Commission, and we're actually pretty unique by international standards, I should say. Not many countries have a body like the PC that is here to advocate for long-term policy in the national interest. And I have international delegations come by the PC all the time and say, gosh, we'd love to have something like what you do. The nature of what we do is that, we put policy ideas out into the world. Some of them are challenging. We're looking to shift the window sometimes, and that means governments won't take them all up, or they certainly won't take them all up right away. When we look back through the kind of back book of our work, you might be surprised we've had perhaps a higher strike rate than some people might expect. Our reports are filled with recommendations, and we do find that they often shift government policy over time. I'm not surprised when we put big ideas out there that there'll be blowback. Businesses' job is to represent businesses. Unions are there to represent workers and the union movement. We are there to take that national interest lens. So we'll keep putting out big ideas. I certainly hope that some of them get picked up in months and years to come. Success for me, though, looks like a better informed policy conversation, and then ultimately long-term policy in the national interest. I think we have delivered that, and I think we'll continue to contribute to that.
I can't push you on a percentage though, like say 10 out of the dozens of recommendations.
Look, you'll just incentivise me to game the system and make lots of small, easy ones. That's what metrics do.
Perhaps aside from the signs up in every department that you mentioned, how will you know whether or not the government at the end of this meeting has what you have called today a growth mindset?
I think, and the point I was trying to make is that leadership comes from the top on this. And, I've already seen this in the sense since government has been talking about productivity and growth, I have felt a difference within public service agencies and others in kind of taking this mission. We would like that to be more formalised through a very clear statement of intent. For me, it'll be when, every single piece of regulation or policy, people are at least considering the impacts of growth. As I said, that doesn't mean you're not going to do things that pursue other environmental and social objectives, but really actively thinking about those trade-offs, as well as pursuing some of the more sizable pieces of reform that we've put out.
Shane Wright from the SMH and the Age.
Oh, g'day, Danny. Shane Wright from the SMH and the Age. Last Friday, the Reserve Bank released a paper on the decline in competition across the Australian economy since the mid-noughties, saying it's probably contributed to a 1 to 3 percentage point lower productivity growth and GDP, or I think $25 to $75 billion. that'd be worth getting out of bed for in the morning, to paraphrase yourself. There's one recommendation specifically in amongst about the 40 that the PC's put out over the last few weeks, which is change regulatory practice to deliver growth, competition and innovation, which sounds a little bit like apple pie. What more specific do you think specific policy levers need to be pulled to get to increase competition, or are you fighting against vested interests that prefer a lack of competition?
So competition is critically important to productivity, and I think that RBA paper was great at highlighting that link. I'm a member of the advisory board of the government's competition task force, which I think is doing really excellent work in progressing some of these conversations. So that's already yielded changes to our mergers law, which is about making sure that the regulator, the ACCC, has power to intervene and actually have visible major mergers that might lessen competition. They've put forward changes to non-compete clauses in employment contracts. But, there is a lot more, I think, that can be done. I mentioned national competition policy in my speech. That provides a vehicle to think about different impediments to competition across the economy. So I don't think it's right, actually, to say our report didn't have recommendations to go to that. Some of the changes we recommended, for example, to occupational licensing are about trying to introduce more competition into various trades and sectors of our economy. I think there's a number of things under national competition policy that will help reduce those barriers over time.
Patrick Commons from The Guardian.
Hi, Danny. Patrick Cummins from Guardian Australia. You've spoken before about how people have lost a bit of faith in economists because they're really good at growth and not so good at trying to figure out how the benefits and the dividends of productivity growth are shared across society and the winners and losers. Have you started to, has the PC started to wrestle with some of these issues when it comes to this growth mindset, into some of the reforms that you've proposed, and in particular for things like artificial intelligence, where there's so much potential, but obviously it's going to be disruptive for a lot of people as well?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think it's absolutely right to say that, you can't have reforms that leave people behind. Growth has been relatively evenly shared in Australia when it comes to income, at least over the past 3 decades. But what I focus on when I'm thinking about growth and how that's shared is really this kind of question of opportunity. So how do we make sure that every person has the opportunity to do well in this country? That's a productivity question. It's also a distribution and a social question. So some of our things that we were talking about when it comes to school education and access to AI go to exactly that point. I think it is going to be important as AI develops. We have new research from Jobs and Skills Australia that says probably the biggest impact on the labour market will be job augmentation, us working with the AI and changing the nature of our jobs as opposed to job loss, but there invariably will be some job losses. I think really importantly, and what we should have learnt from past waves of reform, is that you can't leave people behind. And so that opportunity to help people reskill, there are lots of areas where jobs are going to be growing in our economy is crucially important. We have some reforms that are about that, helping people transition later on in their career, because we need to get the best out of every Australian, and we want to make sure that people are on board for this change. So it does, I think, really permeate when we're thinking about what does good look like, both in terms of the reforms that we undertake, but also the way we respond to big shifts in our economy.
Next question, Katina Curtis from the West Australian.
Thanks, Danielle. Katina Curtis from the West Australian. The talks this week, a big chunk of them is going to be spent on tax reform. It seems like when you say the words tax reform, at least half of Australia immediately jumps to lifting the GST. You haven't made any recommendations about the GST in your reports. Is that because changing it doesn't actually add to productivity or that growth mindset. And I couldn't not ask you, as a representative of the West Australian, one of the last reports you made for Grattan Institute before taking on this role recommended lifting the GST and unwinding the flaw in the arrangement that's in place at the moment. You'll be looking at the GST next year. Do you still stand by those recommendations?
Very good Western Australian question, thank you. We did not try in these reports, as I said, to kind of pick off every worthwhile idea. We decided to take a slice out of tax reform and focus on the corporate tax, and we think that's a really important area to pursue productivity gains. But there are a range of other tax reform options that can yield benefits. I'll speak at a very high level because we haven't put out specific recommendations, but generally anything that switches out higher cost, higher economic drag taxes for lower cost, more efficient taxes will give you a productivity dividend. Equally, anything that broadens the base of a tax, winds back concessions, but then reduces the rate will give you an economic kicker. So, there are a range of different potential packages out there. Some involve GST, some don't involve GST, and ours is an example that doesn't. On the question of the review, yes, we are expecting to receive terms of reference to look at that question of the distribution of GST sometime in coming months. We're due under the legislation to report at the end of next year. We haven't started that process yet. We'll wait till we receive the terms of reference. And like any terms of reference, we start with a blank slate, we start with an open mind. We'll be talking, no doubt, to people in Western Australia, to people in other states, and trying to answer however that terms of reference is framed for us.
And to clarify, you were allowed to make recommendations on the GST and increasing whatever, you just chose to focus on other areas?
That's right. So there was nothing ruled out from our reviews. All the decisions that you see are decisions that we made around prioritising.
Andrew Probram from the Nine Network.
Danielle, first of all, can I say on behalf of a lot of journalists here, we miss you on budget day and your big brain, so perhaps you could give yourself a day off for that particular day, help us see through it all. Look, a cheeky colleague of mine sent me a very funny meme this morning, and for those who can't see it, it looks like a job interview, and it's an older lady. She's sitting on one side of the desk, and she's saying to the lady on the other side of the desk, "I'm looking for someone who can do the work of two men." And the other woman says, who's being interviewed, "So it's only part-time?" So the most important question of the day, of course, is who is more productive, men or women? And in anticipation of the answer, perhaps you could tell us what the productivity gain would be, perhaps through childcare, of getting more women to work longer and back to work sooner.
Well, I have to say I did not have that on my Press Club bingo card today, so thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Look, I think I'll stay away from the gender wars component of that question. But what I will say is I think it's well established, the point that I was making before, that economies perform best when you tap into the broad set of skills and talents across the population. There's a really cool paper in the US that says that if you look at growth from 1960 to I think it's to 2000, a big dividend came from opening up labour markets to women and minorities. All of a sudden you had this broader and deeper pool of talent that you are able to draw on. We have experienced that same thing here. We've seen women's workforce participation rise. That has yielded broader economic dividends. It has yielded social change. We've seen in reforms to the way government fund and subsidise childcare, there has been a kicker in terms of women's workforce participation. Potentially you can get more of that. Like anything, you've got to weigh up the costs and the benefits of change from here.
I'll get you to sign this later then.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Probes. Next question, Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Commissioner Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Before coming here, I was sort of meditating on what maybe the average punter might think about this upcoming economic reform roundtable, and two words came to mind. One, fear. So, a lot of conversations about the transformative power of AI and how that might change our livelihoods, and then also cynicism. Government's already got its agenda planned, this consultation process is a stitch up, etc., etc. Given all the points you made about economic reform, good economic reform sometimes being a matter of inches, change by inches, how do policymakers and politicians sell the story of good economic change if the tangible change is not evident tomorrow or in 3 years' time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so the way I've tried to do that is to explain all the different ways that this matters for people's lives. And, I know politicians try and do this as well, but I think, going out and reiterating why this matters and why the cumulative effect of these changes is important. And I think there are some of these areas where, people kind of really do feel this in their day-to-day lives. So when we talk about housing, for example, I think that's very tangible. Anyone that's tried to build a house, renovate their house, feels trying to put in a pool, has grappled with these challenges around red tape and regulation. Any young person that's tried to buy a house has seen the impacts of these policies over time. So we need to work in these areas where people are actually feeling the pain in a real sense in the economy. On your point around the sort of cynicism and the stitch up, all I can do is talk to my own experience in the lead up to the roundtable, but I haven't found that. We've been pretty active in putting ideas out in the lead up. I think they've had good airing, they've created good conversation and good debate. I expect that to continue around the table over the next few days. As the government's been at pains to point out, this isn't the cabinet. This is not a decision of government, but I think it is a good opportunity to talk about, some of the big rocks that we think could make a difference. Thanks.
So on that, and Phil's pool matters, but everyone's got that anecdote. Is that the one area, housing, where you could almost start it all over again? It's hard to unpick bit by bit some of these crazy regulations. Would it be best just to go from a blank slate? Because we seem so bad and so slow at doing this.
Unfortunately, you never get to start with a blank slate.
Would you like to?
Yeah, what you can do, and we've talked about this through the Competition Task Force, is kind of what we call here root and branch reviews, what's sometimes called zero-based reviews. Think about what does good look like with a clean slate, and then try and work out how you get from where you are to there. I think that will be, in the case of housing, a mixture of trying to streamline some of the existing policies. We've written about opportunities in the National Construction Code, for example, but it goes to planning, it goes to some of the local government regulations. It might also be around kind of crafting incentives to try and get governments to take more ambitious approaches. So I think there's probably a range of things that have to happen. So yes, I'd love to start with a blank page. We don't, but we can try and take a series of steps that take us closer to that blank page solution.
Jacob Steinman from AAP.
Thanks, Danny. Mindful that what you said earlier about not being able to cover everything in your reports, but I'm going to ask you about a policy area that you didn't anyway. Arguably the most inefficient tax in Australia, that is the one that that does the most economic harm, pound for pound, is stamp duty on property transactions. I just want to see your take on what your stance is on that, and whether the Commonwealth should look at progressing on a transition to a broad-based land tax.
So you're right. It's very clear from the modelling that we've done in our tax report that stamp duties stand out as kind of exceptionally economically damaging taxes. They really impact people's, to the previous point, day-to-day decisions. People's decision to move closer to jobs or closer to move to houses that better suit their needs. So these are having very real impacts on people's choices and lives, and that's the economic damage that they cause. The Productivity Commission in the past has been supportive of the idea of reducing stamp duties in return for an increase in broad-based land taxes. There are lots of very thorny transition issues, as some of the states that have tried to do this know. You can end up kind of punching a pretty big hole in your budget up front. You've got the people that have just moved house that have paid the stamp duty that then don't want to pay the land tax. So you've got to work on those issues. But it is certainly an area where I think there is scope for fruitful tax reform. I think whether it's a Commonwealth issue in terms of incentives or we should just expect the states to go it alone, I don't have a position on.
Thanks.
Next question, James Riley from Innovation Oz.
Thanks, Danielle, for that presentation. I wanted to ask you about sovereign capability in AI. Discussions in Australia around AI and data centres have tended to focus on attracting foreign investment for big tech companies to either train models or to run their services using Australian renewables. I guess in relation to your growth mindset, should Australia be investing in sovereign AI factory infrastructure, building our own large language models? And is the transformative nature of AI itself sufficient that it deserves a kind of a special exemption or a special attention in industry development policy?
So I think, I've been very clear about what I think the kind of potential economic upside of AI is. I'm very, and this is the copyright conversation, other conversations, we should be making sure that we're not standing in the way of a domestic industry. We've got to make sure that our regulations support that if it makes sense. So copyright is one area, in building data centres, things like the sort of planning regulations and things that we're talking about when we're talking about housing and clean energy also apply. It, of course, shouldn't be a blank cheque to do things, but we want to make sure that it's not creating impediments to what could be a sizable domestic industry. I think that's a very different question to whether government should actively invest. I haven't seen a strong argument made for that. I think we do have the potential to have private sector led developments. I read the other day about a new LLM that might be launching called Matilda, Australian based one. We think there's scope within universities, research centres, etc. to build out capability. I want to make sure the regulatory settings help support that, and I think that's where the conversation is at rather than more targeted industrial policy.
Next question, Rayanne Tamer from SBS.
Thanks, Danielle. Rayanne Tamer, SBS World News. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned in the Productivity Commission report's immigration. Is low-skilled migration having an impact on lagging productivity? And conversely, is it time for Australia to start rethinking its high-skilled migration targets?
We didn't pick off migration. It sort of fell into the category that I talked about before when we've just sort of had some pretty sizable changes to the rules. We have written before about the productivity opportunity kind of within the high-skilled migration intake. I don't think we've taken a stance as a commission on what that right size of the intake should be. We largely leave that to government, but the point we have made is if you better target that intake towards the migrants that are going to bring the most skills, the biggest productivity spillover, you can get more productivity from a given level of intake. We think, some of the reforms that the government made in the last term, which are around trying to better align the criteria with the things that generate the biggest economic benefits, have been a positive. It didn't necessarily go as far as we would have recommended, but we think it was a step in the right direction. We haven't looked at the question of low skill. I mean, that obviously overlaps with questions around student visas, what people are doing here when they're coming to study. It's not something that we've looked at in detail.
Great, thank you.
Final question, John Keogh from the AFR.
Thanks, Danielle. John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review. The government's agency Jobs and Skills Australia has recently recommended or suggested proposing a new government institution be set up to steward the AI transition and have co-design between business and workers on AI. Does this pass your test that the bureaucracy needs to regulate for growth, and your view that existing laws are largely capable of dealing with AI?
So that report from Jobs and Skills Australia, which came out a week or so ago, really fantastic analysis in there, I think, around the way that AI might impact different sectors and different jobs. I referred to it before, the fact that lots of roles will be augmented with AI. I think that's a really great piece of analysis. On the question of what's the role for employees, we are very supportive of the idea that employees should be consulted when you're making a significant change to technology or a workplace. That's already required generally in EBAs and through other workplace laws. If people think there's a need to sharpen that up or address a gap, we can look at that. But I think on a kind of broader question of co-design or veto, we would be somewhat more sceptical of the need for that. I think it's really important that businesses can embrace what are, really incredible transformative technologies that have the potential to unleash growth across the economy.
Well, we very much appreciate your time the day before you head up the hill and fix productivity around the country. And so much so, we've got this guest speaker membership for you at the club to head back any time. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Danielle Wood.